What are some historical plot twists? Gavrilo Princip was part of a group of 18 or so men who set out to assassinate Archduke Ferdinand, the presumptive heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A bomb thrown at the Archduke's car exploded late, damaging the car behind his and injuring people in that car. Later, the Archduke wanted to go visit the injured people at the hospital. His driver went the wrong way and attempted to back up to turn his car around, right in front of Gavrilo Princip, who was sitting at a cafe, drowning his sorrows. Princip took the opportunity to assassinate the Archduke and his wife, ostensibly starting events that led to WWI. Edit, added a comma. Napoleon escaping exile on Elba, reclaiming his army, winning his throne back, and getting right back into his old empire building ways, only to be defeated at Waterloo. It's really incredible. Normandy landing. Eisenhower had everyone thinking he was going this way, but then was all nam a third are we going this way actually a moron. Alexander Hamilton was involved in America's first political sex scandal, and while his reputation was severely damaged, he seemed to be highly respected after the fact for his forthrightness and being an all-around genius, before he could resume his climb up the political power ladder. However, he was shot and killed in a duel by a fellow New York attorney and sitting US Vice President, Mr. Aaron Burr. Plot twist: Aaron Burr was Alexander Hamilton's mistress's divorce lawyer when she left her husband following the publication of the details of her affair. Spain going bankrupt after seizing all the gold and silver from the recently conquered America. Battle of the Crater. During the siege of Petersburg during the American Civil War, the Union Army devised a plan to break the siege by digging a tunnel from the Union encampment to just underneath one of the forts on the Confederate encampment in Petersburg. At the end of the tunnel, the Union soldiers loaded 8,000 pounds of gunpowder and detonated the lot in hopes of blowing a hole into the town's fortifications. The plan worked initially, as it blew a large hole into the Confederates' fortifications so that the Union Army could go through and capture the town. However, the explosion also left a large smoking crater in the fortifications as well. When the Union forces rushed the area, they got trapped inside the crater, the walls of which were too steep for the soldiers to get out of on both sides. The Confederates slaughtered the troops that were caught in the crater. The tunnel itself was an ingenious plan, but poor planning on the actual commanding of the troops caused the whole thing to be a major Union loss. The Battle of Midway. The Japanese code was broken and us found out that the target was Midway compared to the Aleutian Islands like many believed, like how the Japanese wanted it to be, but when they met a US carrier battle group in full force ready for it, man did they get wrecked. 4 fleet carriers sunk and Japan was on the retreat for the rest of the Pacific War. Glencoe Massacre and Black Dinner, Douglas's Story Co. UK. Both ended up inspiring things from Game of Thrones. I think Terry Pratchett described my country's history best when he said the Scots, locked throughout history in a long drawn-out battle with their arch-enemies, the Scots. Germany invading the Soviet Union during WW2. The Soviet Union had no intentions of joining WW2 on either side until North Sea Germany got a little greedy and decided to push their luck and invade them. James Barry was a highly successful surgeon in 1815. He performed one of the first successful caesarean sections and ranked to Inspector General. He was born Margaret and Bulkley. I'm surprised no one has mentioned Emperor Claudius, whom Robert Graves masterfully portrayed in his series I. Claudius, born a gimp, the black sheep of the imperial family, and nearly caught up in multiple purges during the reigns of Tiberius and Caligula. Claudius very easily could have been killed during the coup that claimed Caligula, and history might have been very different. Instead of succumbing to this fate, he survives captivity with a corrupt Praetorian Guard and is proclaimed emperor. A laughingstock by most counts due to how the Romans perceived disabilities. Claudius still managed to have the most active period of territorial expansion since Augustus and until Trajan. annexing multiple provinces and client kingdoms into full Roman control. Claudius likely even knew his wife was attempting to kill him and was just so tired of the whole thing he said, "Duck it," and let her. My absolute favorite would have to be in 800 AD when Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Invited by the Pope, Charlemagne entered Rome on Christmas Day for a celebratory mass. Whilst praying, the Pope silently approached the King of the Franks and placed the crown of Emperor on his head. A crown which Charlemagne could have taken by force or popular support anytime he wished. At this point in time, the Pope had almost no power in Europe, and by crowning the man who ruled nearly all of it, Leo III cemented the Church's authority over the state for the next 1,000 years. This would occur again in 1804 when Napoleon attempted to unite all of Europe. But cleverly he seized the crown from Pope Pius VI and placed it himself, symbolizing that he was becoming emperor based on his own merits and the will of the people, not because of some religious consecration. 2004, Jack Ryan, a handsome Harvard-educated lawyer and investment banker, is the Republican nominee for the US Senate in Illinois. The outgoing senator was a Republican, and many people thought Ryan would put up a strong fight to hold the seat for the GOP. Then a judge ordered that court records from his 1999 divorce be unsealed, and they show that he allegedly tried to force his then wife Jeri Ryan, yes, that Jeri Ryan, into public sex at BDSM clubs. The resulting controversy forces a humiliated Ryan to withdraw from the race, and the Republicans replace him with certified crazy person Alan Keyes. And that November, the Democratic challenger, Barack Hussein Obama, wins in a landslide. I don't remember the names of these guys, but I remember this story where this Chinese general knew he had a smaller force against his enemy, but he also had a reputation for being extremely cunning. So he used this image of him to his advantage and emptied out his fort and sat in the open playing his musical instrument. When the enemy approached the fort and found it to be empty with just him inside, he was completely convinced it was some sort of booby trap. The enemy called back his forces and the Chinese general held his fort using his cleverness. 2000 AD. George W. Bush gets the presidency. Many Americans aren't exactly thrilled about it. But hey, he can't duck thing up that bad, right? 2009 AD. The next president gets the Nobel Peace Prize just for not being George W. Bush. Catherine the Great staging a coup and taking the throne for herself 6 months after her husband's coronation probably caught a few people off guard at the time. The Rosenbergs were tried and executed during the height of McCarthyism for being communist spies. 4 years. Their case was cited as an egregious miscarriage of justice. The plot twist is that Julius Rosenberg actually was spying for the Soviet Union. Ethel had no idea. Billy Tipton was a jazz musician and band leader in the 30s, 40s and 50s. Tipton had been horribly injured in an accident when he was young, which put an end to him having a traditional sex life, so he and his life partner adopted 3 sons. Upon his death in 1989, his sons and now ex learned the truth about Billy. There had been no accident in his childhood. Instead, Billy had been born a woman and had been living a secret life as a man so she could make it in an industry that did not provide much opportunity for women. His sons never suspected a thing. On top of that, Billy had a long list of former romantic relationships with girlfriends who never found anything odd with his story. Finland repelling a Russian invasion. Twice. The most disturbing is, whilst the US was all caught up in trying to track down non-existent Iraqi weapons of terror, it seems that North Korea became a nuclear power right under everyone's nose. The Spanish Inquisition. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. When America joined WW2 after Pearl Harbor was bombed by the Japanese, which was done in an effort to stop America's intervention in WW2. The Zimmermann telegram. During the Great War, WW1, Germany was working Mexico to join on their side. The British intercepted and used it to convince the US to join the war. Wikipedia.org. King Croesus and the Oracle of Delphi in 560 BC. Before setting out a campaign against King Cyrus of Persia, he consulted the Oracle of Delphi, who told King Croesus that if he attacks Persia, he would destroy a great nation. Plot twist, he was defeated by King Cyrus. Turns out the great nation was his own kingdom. The end of the Philippine-Spanish War. Filipinos asked help from the Americans. Turns out the country was bought from the Spanish and the Philippine-American War starts. Just got reminded of this from you, House Atomic. On the 16th of March, 1979, the movie The China Syndrome comes out. On March 28, 1979, 3 Mile Island, Wikipedia.org melts down. The reason why coal, oil and gas are the dominant power methods in the US has in no small part been the fact that this movie, The Meltdown, and Chernobyl made the general public afraid of nuclear power. Like the time the most famous actor in the world saved the future president's son from serious injury and possible death. Growing up in Michigan, I was told a story about how a revolutionary commander captured a British occupied force that held at least twice his forces by having his men march at extended rank, making it appear that he had a great deal more than he had. I had thought this happened at Fort Mackinac, but I found no reference. But the fort is pretty interesting nonetheless. Wikipedia.org. First, during the War of 1812, a British commander wasn't sure if the war was actually on, so he sent a canoe to find out. And they returned telling them to attack the fort. The undermanned fort surrendered rather and let the British slaughter them. The noble commander just made them promise not to fight again, and had the local natives pledge allegiance to the crown. Shortly after this, 2 ships from Chicago arrived, neither aware that war had broken out, much less that the fort was taken. The Brits put up an American flag and tricked the ships into landing and captured them. That's a nice plot twist. Next, a fur trapper went to the fort after the war looking to sell. A musket accidentally discharged and blew a hole in his abdomen. The fort doctor watched over him, expecting him to die soon. Instead, the guy survived and lived with a rope and hole in his gut. The amazed doctor cared for him at his home and inspected the hole, gaining a great understanding of digestion and now being considered the father of modern gastrointestinal physiology. I wonder if an open-ended question like this would be permitted on our Ask Historians. Good question, but every comment below seems to be falling into "but that's not what really 100% happened" traps. In the 13th century, Christianity in the East was faltering before the might of Islam. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had been all but lost by this point, and the disastrous Fourth Crusade had culminated in the sacking of Constantinople. This resulted in the temporary, albeit devastating, dissolution of the Byzantine Empire, which only furthered the influence of the Anatolian Turks. Meanwhile, in the land of Rus, the principalities were constantly being raided by nomadic tribes. But then the Christians began to hear reports that the forces of Islam were ailing. News of these mysterious mounted knights who were attacking the Muslim nations from the rear in the east, defeating their armies in battle and conquering vast swaths of land. And so the Christians envisioned this to be the work of some great and chivalrous Christian king, whose people had long been separated from the rest of Europe by a sea of infidels, but were now making great gains in their return to save Christendom and drive the Muslims back. Of course, this supposed magnanimous Christian king ended up being the Mongol horde. Battle of Kursk. Soviets found out Germany wanted Kursk. The Soviets met them with 2.5 million troops. In the Sengoku Jide period, the Matsudaira clan was fighting a war with the neighboring Oda clan in 1548. The Matsudaira defenses capitulate to an Oda invasion. The desperate Matsudaira leader asks the neighboring Imagora for an alliance. The Imagora offer help on the condition that the eldest Matsudaira son be given hostage as security. On the way to the Imagora keep, the convoy is ambushed and the Oda sees the Matsudaira boy. The Oda demand the Matsudaira to turn traitor to the Imagora, or they'd have the boy killed. The Matsudaira leader writes back and says to a brilliant catch-22. The Oda could kill his son, But the Matsudaira leader retorts that it would demonstrate his unwavering commitment to the Imagawa. The Oda could leave his son alive, but he's useless as a bargaining chip if the Matsudaira leader is this foolhardy. In a time when hostages are executed left and right. This is a brilliant maneuver. In 1889, Western powers raced to claim land for their own imperial desires. Although this was most notable in Africa, the powers were just as eager to claim islands in the Pacific. The Kingdom of Samoa is embroiled in a civil war. The German Empire, the British Empire, and the US all back different sides during the Civil War. Tension is increasing, and with each passing day the military presence for all three factions grows stronger. A cyclone comes along and destroys all the military presence all three powers have on the island. Diplomats agree to end the crisis and support the king, and war is averted. Until 1898. Gallipoli has to be up there. Britain, NZ, French and Australia sent a ton of men to fight the Ottomans. The British were favored as the victors and were going to make WW1 much more winnable for them. They got slaughtered over 8 months. I don't think any of the landings by the British and French were successful. And there were a lot of landings. Sure, the Ottomans lost a lot of men, actually just the same as the British. But compared to how many men they had to begin with, the British sure lost that one. I think it caused a generational crisis later on because of how many young soldiers died. The Mongols, a fighting force the world had never seen the likes of before, had all but taken over China and decided their next goal was Japan. They packed up their supplies, readied their soldiers, and sailed to their next conquest. Japan meanwhile was in a bit of disarray with no real organized military to meet them even when they got news of this massive military's approach. The Mongols were ready for an easy conquest, and had their entire fleet destroyed by a freak typhoon. Years later they decided to start that campaign anew and take Japan once and for all. They sailed across again. Japan once again too busy with its own matters to put up much of a fight, and were destroyed in another freak typhoon. The end. Battle of Saulsu. When the Chinese were trying to invade Korea in the 7th century, they sent a massive army of over 300,000 men to do that. The Koreans only had a few thousands, and were retreating into their own territory running away from the Chinese. At Saulsu River, the Chinese were crossing a ford towards some Korean fortress. But then it turns out that the shallow waters they were crossing weren't a ford, but were artificially kept shallow by a nearby dam. The Koreans had opened the dam, flooding the lowland, and 300,000 Chinese soldiers died. Only a couple thousands remained. It was so devastating that the dynasty ruling China at the time collapsed soon afterwards. In the Book of Esther has sort of an ironic plot twist that you guys can probably appreciate even if you're not religious. I like to think of Esther as sort of a season finale of the Bible. It takes place in Persia, during the reign of King Xerxes, a generous god from 300. Haman, the high official who makes it his life's goal to annihilate the Hebrews, turns out to be a descendant of King Agag, a man who was spared by the ancient Hebrew king Saul about half a millennia prior. Had Saul listened to God's commands to wipe out every last shred of the Amalekites, the Hebrews would have never been under threat of genocide in Persia. However, Haman's plans are thwarted by Mordecai, a Hebrew working for the king as a spy, and Esther, the queen. Both Esther and Mordecai were descendants of a man whom David pardoned from execution because he believed that God was using him. During the Ottoman siege of Constantinople in 1422, the Ottoman Empire was struggling to take the city. Cannons at the time were incredibly slow to arm and fire as they required cleaning after every firing, so the damage to the thick walls was minimal. The city was incredibly well defended even though its troops were incredibly outnumbered. The Byzantines know that the Ottomans had a fearsome navy and floated a large chain through the cape, meaning that any ships that would move through would be scuttled. So they sailed back out to sea and shored their boats. They then cut down thousands of trees, greased them and pushed their boat through the hills and around the blockade. Even with this, the Ottomans weren't able to take the city, and it was too well defended from the waterside as well, since the Byzantines left their navy in the Cape. So how did the Ottomans get into Constantinople? Someone on the, I think, third outer wall left the ducking gate unlocked and the Ottomans got in. They sieged the city for months and war season was almost over, meaning they would have to turn and go back to the empire, and someone left the gate open. TLDR, the Ottomans took Constantinople in 1422 by someone leaving the gate open. Edit, you guys are right, I stated the wrong siege. There were a few and I of course put the wrong one. Inside the hull of the Lusitania were munitions and weapons bound for the United Kingdom, making it a justified military target for the German blockade. Despite this, which was only learned much later when the sunken ship was investigated, the United States joined the war on the side of the Allies, in addition to other factors, which led to the ultimate defeat of Germany. Ignác Semmelweis was a Hungarian physician who discovered that puerperal fever, severe vaginal infection caused during birth by doctors with insanitary hands, was spread by something on the doctor's skin. After years and years of studying, he took leaps and bounds towards modern sanitation that cut puerperal mortality rates in greater than half. But he was unable to give any specific reasoning to why disease spread. He was labeled an quack and eventually put in an institution. After getting in a fight with another patient, his wounds became infected and he died of, you guessed it, puerperal fever. During WW2, the Soviets had an extensive network of spies. Richard Sorge had established a spy cell in Japan, and one of his confidants was General Huguenot, the German ambassador to Japan. Through this network, the USSR discovered that Japan had no intention to invade the USSR in 1941. When Germany made a final push for Moscow in 1941, the USSR transferred 32 divisions from Siberia and the Far East to defend the capital and delivered a crushing blow to Germany. This finally put Germany on the defensive and began the counterattack, which would lead to the downfall of Berlin just over 3 years later. A British soldier in the First World War spotted a German soldier walking near the trench. He lifted his rifle to shoot the German, but hesitated. He saw the German was injured, so he lowered his rifle. The German nodded to him and wandered off. Apparently, this German soldier was Adolf Hitler. Saint Olga of Kiev protected her son's claim to the throne by systematically eliminating all the powerful men of the opposing kingdom. First by having them buried alive, locked into a bathhouse and burnt alive, and then slaughtered at dinner. She then marched on the enemy city and threatened to slaughter everyone if each household did not give her a pigeon or dove. The city complied. Olga then had sulfur and flint tied to the pigeons and doves and released them back toward the city. The birds nested and set off a chain reaction of massive fires across the entire city, as Olga's army slaughtered or enslaved those who tried to flee the destruction. TLDR, Olga slays all the nobles of a kingdom, then exterminates said kingdom to avenge her husband and protect her son. All by surprise and deception.